Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Ancient Warfare Answers with me, Murray, your weekly fix of ancient warfare-related rant by me, where you ask a question, I attempt to answer it in 10 minutes. Sometimes I get it in on time, sometimes I do not. Now, this question is from Chris. Dear Mr. Darm, I recently read your article on the Siege of Masada in Ancient Warfare magazine and had a couple of questions regarding the assumptions made about the shortened timeline of the siege. Specifically, you mentioned two assumptions supporting the idea of a shorter siege. I was curious if you could provide more information or sources to support this hypothesis. Additionally, I have a colleague who views Josephus's work with skepticism, considering him to be a collaborator whose writings might have served Roman propaganda. Given this perspective, I was wondering why there seems to be such a heavy reliance on Josephus, especially considering the article's focus on Legion X Fretensis rather than Josephus's narrative. Okay. I may have missed something in the article and would appreciate any clarification for further insights. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to hearing from you. Right. Thanks, Chris. Okay. So one of the issues, of course, with any writer writing under Rome, having been an enemy of Rome, the two main examples, of course, are Josephus himself and Polybius in the 2nd century BC. What does that hostage situation mean for their reliability? And it's fascinating that the opening of Josephus's Jewish War is a huge apology for historians in general and a massive argument by Josephus about why he's going to be a reliable source. Now, at various different points, and Masada is one of them, he talks about not being an eyewitness, but talking to veterans and survivors. And for some parts of the war, until his own capture, of course, he is an eyewitness. He does know the personalities involved, but he is taken captive by Rome, and he does write for an explanation of what happened. For a Roman audience, he tells us that he's actually written this history in his own language. We think it's either Hebrew or Aramaic, and he's translated it into Greek. So it certainly has an audience in mind. Whether that means we should be completely skeptical about what he tells us is a different kettle of fish. Coming to your later question, really when it comes to this period, we rely on Josephus because Josephus is the dominant source for what we've got. Archaeology helps us, but the other historians don't deal with the Masada or the Jewish revolt in any depth in comparison to Josephus. So we do rely on Josephus's narrative. And so I think in that sense, skewing it, so obviously the theme of the issue was on X Fretensis, which we know was involved in the campaign, and then Masada. Skewing it to that, you can read between the lines about X Fretensis from what Josephus tells us, even though, as so many historians don't actually specifically mention which legion they're talking about at all times. They may mention it once and then never again, and we have to extrapolate, oh, that's the same legion that's being talked about. Now, at the opening of Josephus's history, I said it easily that time, what's going on? We get this massive, I'm using the lerb or the lobe, depending on where you're listening. You've got this huge sort of 15-chapter long discussion of historians. Now, there's an interesting parallel that the other author, historian / writer who goes into such depth in the same way is actually Lucian's on how to write history. And there's probably some parallels which I won't have time to talk about today, certainly not in 10 minutes. Now, what he tells us is the war of the Jews against the Romans, the greatest not only of the wars of our own time, but as far as accounts have reached us, well nigh of all that ever broke out between cities or nations, has not lacked its historians. Interestingly for us, it does, because they don't survive. Of these, however, some, having taken no part in the action, have collected from hearsay casual and contradictory stories which they have then edited in a rhetorical style, while others who witnessed the events have, either from flattery of the Romans or from hatred of the Jews, misrepresented the facts, their writings exhibiting alternating invective and encomium, but nowhere historical accuracy. Woo-hoo-hoo, which is a big claim for Josephus saying, I'm not going to be that. In these circumstances, I, Josephus, son of Matthias, a Hebrew by race, a native of Jerusalem and a priest, who at the opening of the war myself fought against the Romans and in the sequel was perforce an onlooker, proposed to provide the subjects of the Roman Empire with a narrative of the facts by translating into Greek the account which I had previously composed in my vernacular tongue and sent to the barbarians in the interior. Now, we think that means upcountry barbarians, so that's who it was for. Now, it's interesting that he's making a claim. Now, this is a very common claim for historians to make, that they are the better historian. They're more reliable than any other source. But I don't know that skepticism of Josephus is warranted. There are things that Josephus tells us which can be borne out to be true through other sources. And there are also things where Josephus is it. For instance, the marching order. Have I got my head right? I think Josephus tells us that they're 4 abreast when they march, and Arrian later in 135 is telling us 6. Or is it the other way around? Might be the other way around. Might be Josephus says 6 abreast and Arrian says 4. There's other aspects of the order of the march, for instance, in which case which units come first, does seem to be corroborated by a later marching order by Arrian, for instance. Only a couple of changes. And that really adds weight to the reliability of Josephus. There are some things, these big reported speeches that he can't have heard, and, some events which he describes which are very similar. The suicide pact at Masada is very similar to his own suicide pact that he survives at Chapata. So, all of these things are moments, but I don't think any one of them really undermines him, nor would I say that it's Roman propaganda as such. It's not pro-Roman enough to be propaganda. It is written under Rome. It is written probably in the 70s, maybe later. And it's interesting in that sense to understand, well, who's he writing under? If he's writing under Vespasian or Titus, that's one thing. If he's writing under Domitian, that could be another kettle of fish entirely. But nothing in Josephus' account is enough to undermine, in my mind, his reliability. But as with any ancient historian, you've got to take it with a grain of salt. But very often, we don't have any corroboration to be able to go, right, well, let's throw that out because it's unreliable, because you don't have anything to replace it with. On those occasions where we do get corroboration within Josephus himself, so for instance, between the Jewish antiquities and the Jewish war, or even his against Appian or his own life, he's consistent across those writings. And so in that sense, I think it's very tricky to brand him with the collaborator or the traitor brush. I think that branding tends to lean the other way, that you're actually trying to be too pro the Jewish opposition. And so the balance doesn't exist. You're looking as all history, we're trying to uncover, I won't use the word the truth, but you're trying to uncover what happened, what actually happened. What actually happened in every case of every historical event is nuanced and will be different based on whoever's perspective we get. Again, and one of our problems in ancient history is often we have one perspective, not, we're stuck with a single perspective. Sometimes historians tell us that there are various different versions of stories and that they've chosen the one that they accept, which is interesting. There, for instance, we get multiple historians of this war, which is current, well, not current, but very recent history, and none of them survive for us. So we're dealing with a very limited number of sources. Again, archaeology does back up what Josephus tells us, especially with the siege of Masada. Some of the other locations we don't even know, and some of the other locations, the location of the camp in Jerusalem, for instance, is unknown. There's arguments about it. There's some of those arguments are divisive, and some of them are designed to be divisive, which is not helping anyone. But then at the same time, sometimes when you're trying to uncover what really happened, people will interpret that as being divisive. And that's not the case necessarily either. So it's a very tricky one to balance all of that. I don't think there's enough in Josephus to say that he's a collaborator with Rome. I think there's enough to saying now when I say the word obsequious, I don't mean it in its modern sense. I mean it in its ancient sense of obsequium, which is appropriate behavior. He's a hostage at Rome. Of course, he's going to write a version of the history of the war with a Roman audience in mind. He tells us that's what he's doing. That's why he's translated it into Greek. There will be things he says that will be toned down than what he might have said in a different way for a different audience. We don't have the original Josephus to compare it to, for instance. So that's not collaboration. That's, well, good sense. So it's very tricky. But I certainly don't get the sense from the Jewish war that he's anti his own people or so pro-Rome that they can make no mistakes or do nothing wrong. There's all sorts of very interesting nuance. For instance, his portrait of Mucianus comes before his portrait of Vespasian. That's interesting. So, all of those things are happening. Anyway, I hope that answers your question, Chris, and I look forward to seeing you again for another episode of Ancient Warfare Answers. Thanks. Bye.